2023 is winding down fast. I can't believe we're just a few short weeks away from 2024, which is like a year from science fiction movies or books, a far distant future. But hey, I guess the future's now. I'm Jessica Marshall, and we are here with another episode of The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. This month was newsworthy for a wide variety of reasons. I'll point you toward timesunion.com to read more about that, but we are going to focus on one particular story at the top of the show here, and that is the ousting from Congress of former New York Representative George Santos. He was only the sixth in history to get the boot. He's now facing more than a dozen charges of financial crimes, including alleged wire fraud, identity theft, and campaign finance violations. He was in court this week in Long Island, where prosecutors say a plea deal may be in the works. The former Congress member was the topic of conversation last week at our Hearst Media Center. Times Union editor Casey Seiler hosted a conversation with author and former Newsday columnist Mark Chisano about his book, The Fabulist, the lying, hustling, grifting, stealing, and very American legend of George Santos. It was a fascinating conversation, and we're going to play a portion of it for you right now.
I do note that in The Fabulist, you pay very close attention to the kind of political ecosystem of Long Island, which is so unique, and you pay very close attention to Santos's victims, which are both significant elements of Robert Caro's playbook. So I would just ask you to kind of comment on how you kind of structured the telling of this and why both of those things were important elements in the telling of this story.
Absolutely. I once called Robert Caro, who no longer works at Newsday, but it was for a story about, it was during COVID, it was when the beaches were closed, and I had this idea that I was going to try to do a story about what that meant, like that we were closing the beaches, was this sort of unfair, and I was thinking about Caro's book, obviously, and I called a couple numbers for him, and then finally I found one that was like just a listed number at a house, and he picks up and he's like, "Who is this? Like, how did you find this number?" And I got like 4 seconds of a quote from him. I was like, I got it, bam, all right. But no, he's a great writer and biographer. And I was thinking about, a couple of things that he does. He focuses on the victims for sure, which I think is kind of one piece of the Santos story that is easy to forget, right? He's hilarious, he's crazy, he's now no longer a member of Congress, but he has left this trail of victims behind him, right? Not quite like Moses in the Cross Bronx Expressway, but only because he didn't have enough power, right? He has this long trail of financial victims that were close to him often. And that's what kind of struck me early on. We all thought we sort of knew the Santos story, I think, from pretty quickly after the Times' great piece. And then more reporters kept digging in and finding more. And then I started calling around even more, and just more stuff just kept bubbling to the surface, especially about his family. He'd been stealing from his aunt, who's this woman who immigrated from Brazil, worked very hard, doted on him as a kid, used to buy him sweets and clothes, steals thousands of dollars from her. It's just like, it's unbelievable. A grandmother who, I went to Brazil for a month to report on the book. Grandmother's no longer alive, but I found her, the doorman at the building that she used to live. And the doorman told me that this was a woman who went to church every day, and I went into the church where she would go to services every day. Santos stole hundreds of dollars from her too. It was just everyone whose path he crosses. So I thought that was an important part of the story. I also think that where he comes from is a very important part too, because he's really shaped by New York, by Queens, by Brazil and Long Island. And so I did want to kind of have that in here for it to be, because I don't think that Santos himself, he didn't spring from nowhere. He was kind of created by these places. So I did think that was an important part of the story.
You note that his story is, just to sort of follow up on that, a very New York City type of tale, the idea that the city, especially for people who are coming up from kind of meaner economic circumstances, is one in which you do hustle, you do fake it, and if you do that long enough, you will become a magnet for money and for the attention that you crave.
It works, right? It's not, he's not the first New York City hustler to, sort of brave this path. I found it so interesting, the things that he would lie about, right? So Horace Mann, it's this school, it's this very sort of fancy private school in New York City. And there are some elements of Santos's story that he backtracked on. He said, sure, you're right, I didn't go to college. I didn't go to Baruch, I didn't play volleyball. A couple other things he sort of allowed that he lied on. Horace Mann, he continues to sort of claim, like, yes, I did go to Horace Mann for 6 months and 1 year, and their records are wrong. And so this presents a challenge for any journalist, right? Because we want to sort of check things with our sources, and we want to get the truth, right? So if someone's telling us, like, no, actually, I really am not lying about this, this is real, you go and check it out. And so I did. I got a bunch of yearbooks from Horace Mann, and I turned every single page in the Caro way. This is like less serious than Caro. I'm turning Horace Mann yearbooks. He's turning documents of import. But what are we gonna do? It's 2023. So I'm looking through all his yearbook pages. He's not there. Finally, literally, it was like the 10th to last page I turned. I find a Gabriela Santos who's in the class literally the year that Santos doubles down and claims he was there, and so I call her. Hilariously, she was an actual J.P. Morgan employee. She actually went to now I'm forgetting which college it was, but like one of the sort of colleges that he claimed to go to. So I'm like, oh my God, did I find like a cousin or something? But it's not. She has no relation to him. And I say to her, like, would you have remembered a guy from Brazil, with Brazilian background, with your exact last name? And she's like, yeah, it's a pretty white school, definitely. So anyway, these are the lengths you go. But it's interesting that he chose Horace Mann because it is this very white, very ritzy, very expensive school. But even when he was unmasked, he continued sort of having this chip on his shoulder and wanting to pretend that he'd been to these places that he hadn't.
You mentioned the Baruch volleyball claim. As you note, that is such an easily debunked claim. A volleyball, did I say basketball? Volleyball is, whether it's volleyball or basketball, people go to those matches. They are recorded. There are, team rosters and all that stuff. And which kind of begs the question that pertains to a lot of these things. Do you think that he believed in some way, that he had convinced himself that if it wasn't true, it should have been true?
I deserve to be on the Baruch volleyball team, yeah. I think there's something to that. I sort of developed like almost a taxonomy of the Santos lies after doing this for too long. But one of the types of lying that he does, I think, is that he's a riffer. So if you go back to that original interview where he mentions the volleyball thing, it's a radio interview, and it's two hosts who, I may be mangling this slightly, but basically their daughters go to schools that including Baruch, and played two sports that Santos claimed to have played, volleyball and tennis. So they mention this, the hosts do, and Santos is like, oh yeah, totally, I play that as well. And so like he's trying to, establish a commonality between these radio hosts, right? And then he just takes it too far. He like goes over the top with a specific story. And it's a sort of catch-22 because he's a good liar because he's a specific liar, right? Like that's why his lies are interesting and memorable, and that's why people, were sort of, thought he was impressive, right? Because he had specific things that he pointed to in his past. Of course, those specificities are easier to debunk.
I think you mentioned at another point that I think it's in a debate with Zimmerman where he talks about Christmas around the household, and then Santos immediately tries to one-up him on Sweatpit back
Yeah,
there.
Sweatpants and Haagen-Dazs, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, that was their family tradition. And Zimmerman, you could see it in the video. Zimmerman's just like, that's what I just said, you know? Yeah, and they're very different people. Yeah.
But it's that kind of, Zelig comes up a lot, that as in, you know, Woody Allen's Zelig, you've got a character who is trying to fit in, trying to make himself into that which he feels will be accepted and celebrated.
I think that's totally right. You know, and by the way, with the volleyball, another piece of that, another taxonomy of stealing of the stories of the lying is that he sometimes will steal someone's story. So there was a former boss of his, this guy Pablo Oliveira, who was in fact a Baruch volleyball star. Also a Brazilian, man of Brazilian, background, and so Santos clearly knew this guy and seems to have kind of borrowed his story and then makes it his own. And so then part of that taxonomy, I think, is, like you said, does Santos actually believe these lies once he's stolen them, once he's made them his own? And I talked to one memorable person who, you know, had an interaction with Santos who totally thought that he believed it. And the interaction was that this guy is another politician, a sort of younger Queens politician. And so Santos, is talking to him and says, you know, how old are you again? And this politician says, whatever, something in his 20s. And Santos goes, yes. He doesn't like skip a beat. He's like, oh, I remember when I was your age, like I'd made my first $1 million already. And there's just something that the guy didn't exactly know how to describe it, but I totally got what he was trying to tell me, that clearly Santos believed it. You know, there was no hesitation. There was no like flitting of the eyes or something. There was no backtracking. It was just, this is his reality. So I think sometimes he must believe these lies.
For more on Casey's conversation with author Mark Chisano, head over to timesunion.com. While you're at it, check out more on any of the issues that we've discussed on this podcast. Be sure to catch us on social media as well. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, we will discuss a controversial policy at the Crossgates Mall Lululemon store.
If you're enjoying this podcast, take advantage of all the Times Union has to offer and support our efforts to bring you award-winning journalism by becoming a Times Union subscriber today. Go to timesunion.com/subscribe.
Welcome back. You're listening to The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Marshall. If you have ever been to the mall with a young child, or even if you've observed someone toting a small child around the mall, you'll definitely have some thoughts about our next segment. Kristi Gustafson Barlette joins me now to talk about some controversy over an alleged store policy at the Crossgates Mall Lululemon. So Lululemon is no stranger to controversy. There have been a couple of things over the last couple of years that have sort of launched it into the headlines for all the wrong reasons. You know, the whole thigh gap thing, accusations of racism toward employees. There was that whole thing in Buffalo, too, with the wide right. Like, it's not new that Lululemon would be stirring up a controversy. And I think you have stumbled upon what might be the latest controversy at Lululemon. So I'm going to start with that and let you just tell us what happened in early December that has led you to this.
Yeah, so I was in Lululemon in Crossgates Mall. I've been there many, many times with my children. But this time I was told that me and my daughter, who's 9, could not go in the dressing room together. And I thought, well, that's strange. And they said, well, because it's a 1 person per dressing room policy. I'm not rolling in with my sister or my mother or my friend or my husband or anybody else, but it's my child. And she looked behind me and looked at my child and confirmed that my child was not a baby, because babies can go in. And obviously my child's not a baby. And so she said, nope, you can't. Either she goes in and you stay out, or you go in and she stays out. So this just seemed crazy to me. So there were two staffers there. I asked them both. I said, so same thing if I was with a 4, 5, 6-year-old, 3-year-old. Yes, no matter what, that person stays out, you go in. So I said, well, who's responsible for the children? Are you the staff? And she said, well, no, as if it was the most outrageous question I could have asked. There wasn't really an answer on who's responsible for the children, but there was an answer on those children are not going in the dressing room.
Okay. So you and I are both the parents of children who should not be left alone in a mall without supervision. That is kind of ridiculous, right? Like, okay, you can't have let's say you have like a 6-year-old with you. He would tear the place, my son would tear the place apart like the Tasmanian devil. Like, and then I would be worried too about somebody snatching them or something happening. Like, that just seems like it's inviting a lot of trouble for the store.
Well, exactly, right. So there's mannequins, and I feel like all you need is like a kid pulling an arm off or something off a mannequin and then getting hit in the head by the arm. But regardless, dismantling the display, pulling on the other clothes, walking around, they're always folding things nicely and laying the bags out nicely. Well, kids just love, as you and I both know, love to destroy things that look nice. So kids are messing up things. Kids have sticky hands and messy faces and they're touching the clothes. Not that that can't happen if the parents are there, but if a parent is there, they're watching it. So it's not fair to the child because I think the child could be scared to be left out in the store alone. Even on the other side of a door, it's still out on their own. So there's that. I don't think it's fair to the staff because at the end of the day, the staff may say they're not responsible and technically they're not. But I would think any logical person, if the child takes off from the store out to the mall, that person's going to try to stop the child, you would think, if they notice it. So it's not fair to the staff. And it's also not fair to the other customers who should be able to shop in relative peace.
This all seems like it might be at odds with one of its core demographics. I mean, moms who wear athleisure.
All of my mom friends wear athleisure, right? So whether that's Lululemon, Athleta, one of the brands at Dick's Sporting Goods, pretty much every mom I know loves athleisure wear, especially with work from home and things like that. So it would seem, and pretty much most of my friends like Lululemon. So I would say that, yes, a huge part of their demographic. Yeah, sure, there are 18-year-olds in their demographic and there are 58-year-olds in their demographic. I think generally speaking, it's probably women in their 30s and 40s, right? Because it's a little bit more expensive. So you have to be a little established and have been working a bit to be able to afford it. But it's also trendy. So, moms who want to be trendy go toward that. And it's colorful. The reason I like it is it's colorful clothing that's made pretty well.
Yes. And as the sport that I'm engaged in, which I've mentioned many times on this podcast, the leggings are particularly perfect for practicing figure skating. And I have been on teams before where the required uniform has been Lululemon. So it's always been kind of like something that I have gone to, not necessarily for the label, but because it produces a good product. But back to the demographics, right? Like, it seems like this business decision, whatever you want to call it, is alienating parents. And it's not just an issue with women either, because Lululemon, has stuff for men as well. So conceivably a dad could go into the store with their kid too. And then if they can't bring their kid in the dressing room, then they can't really shop there, right? Or they're less likely to shop there.
I will say I love Lululemon. I track it down sometimes, like the outlet stores and things like that. My kids are typically with me. I've never not been able to bring them into the dressing room. And I personally would not buy from a store like Lululemon without trying the clothes on because, like most retailers these days and designers, the sizes range. I could fit into an 8 in one item or even a 6 in one item and a 12 in another item. So I can't just look at the rack, say, okay, I'm going to grab that in an 8 and walk out the door. It's like, no, I'm going to try it on before I spend whatever, $99 on a pair of leggings, $119. I'm going to try it on because I'm not going to spend my money without trying something on. Okay, maybe you can return it, but why do I want to have to go back and do that? If you aren't going to let me in the dressing room with my child, well, then I'm not going to buy product because I'm definitely going to try it on.
You reached out to Lululemon, as one should, when we are looking into something like this, and they responded. What did they say?
They did. So they apologized immediately. They said this should not have happened. We are sorry. This is not the experience we intended, but I will actually tell you their exact statement. At Lululemon, ensuring our guests feel safe and have a positive experience in our stores is our top priority. We do not have a policy restricting children from accompanying parents into fitting rooms. We apologize for the inconvenience this experience caused and are taking steps to ensure we continue to provide a welcoming and positive shopping experience for all guests. There was no saying, oh, that didn't happen. Well, because interestingly, I had posted about it to social media with a little ludicrous or logical. This is what happened. What do you think? And I think there was 180 comments, and 179.5 of those comments was, that's ridiculous. Even people who said, I'm not a parent and I know that's ridiculous, or I don't shop there and I think it's ridiculous. Everyone recognized it was ridiculous. But what was interesting was there was one of my readers who had the same thing happen to her in that store this summer in July.
So it's been going on for some time now.
It's been going on. They told me just a couple of months when I asked about it, because I thought, oh, I was just with my kids in the Lululemon in Maine this summer and they were in the dressing room with me. So I asked her. She said a couple of months. This woman shared the letter she had written to corporate and the correspondence that happened at the time. So the interesting thing was she shared it in July, right, with the company, and it didn't change.
That's interesting. And I suppose if it had been a company-wide policy, right, if Lululemon hadn't written you and told you that this explicitly wasn't a company policy, that we would have heard about this happening elsewhere, right? I'm sure it would have popped up.
Oh, it would have popped up. I don't know why any store would want the liability of your kids out roaming around loose in a store while you're in the dressing room. It just seems, because also something's going wrong and you have no pants on. What are you supposed to do? Come flying out the door and chasing your kid through Crossgates pantsless? Like, that's not going to work.
The thing that we have to watch out for now is if the store, when confronted with the fact that their corporate does not have this policy, if they change their tune.
Well, yes. And I was told, that because you know how corporate works, there's different levels there. It's not just like one person calls another person and things change, right? There's a whole process and procedure. So I'm sure it's like it has to go to the training team or whatever. Then they talk to the managers, then the managers talk to the staff. So it's not like I was told no yesterday and today all is good and you can bring 12 kids in the dressing room with you.
Which I have no intention of doing. If I am going to Lululemon, my first choice isn't to bring my 6-year-old. My first choice would be to leave my 6-year-old with a babysitter or my spouse or something, because I would like the leisure of trying something on.
Because that's not even an easy try on. Like anyone who's tried on a pair of Lululemon leggings knows you got to shake your body into those things. There's a lot of pulling and grabbing. It's not just like pulling a sweater over your head where you're like, okay, on, off, and we're done. Yeah. It's like the shoes come off. The socks might have to come off. You've got to pull it up. It's like, ideally, I don't want anyone in the dressing room, but I need to have my children there because they're my responsibility, not your responsibility. Right. And I'm also going to just be really haphazard and quick if you make my kids stand outside the dressing room and I'm just looking to make sure their feet are still there, right, rather than paying attention and making a smart buying decision. And I go back to their stuff is not inexpensive. No. So it's like you're not just buying there haphazardly. You're making decisions based on, okay, yes, this is worth it. This is an investment piece. And yes, I want to go with it.
All right, that's it for this week. I'm Jessica Marshall. We'll be back next week with another look inside the newsroom. The Eagle is a production of the Times Union. It's produced and edited by myself with help from the Times Union digital team and the newsroom. Special thanks this week to Casey Seiler and Kristi Gustafson Barlette for contributing to this episode.